evening and welcome everybody. I'm Tony Lemieux. I'm a founding co-director of the Atlanta Global Studies Center, and I want to welcome you all to our symposium. We are honored tonight to have our opening keynote address from Dr. Elizabeth F. Cohen, and she's going to be speaking on her book, Illegal, which I cannot recommend strongly enough. Superbly researched, incredibly, well written, but accessible at the same time. I mean, I think when you think about how we make our scholarship accessible and available, this is like sort of exhibit A. We'll get a chance to really talk about that in some depth. I'll quickly introduce Dr. Cohen and then welcome some remarks from my colleague, Dr. Anna Stemport, co-director of the Atlanta Global Studies Center. But Dr. Elizabeth Cohen's a professor of political science at Syracuse University, an associate editor of the American Journal of Political Science. She's the author of 4 books, including Illegal, The Political Value of Time, Semi-Citizenship in Democratic Politics, and Citizenship. So 4 books across her career, and is also a public scholar, so has published op-eds in the Atlantic, the Washington Post, and Politico. Her research interests focus on immigration, contemporary political theory, justice, citizenship, and rights. In fall of 2020 and spring of 2022, she'll be on leave at the Princeton University Center for Human Values, where she's working on a book about the political significance of line waiting and the rise of short-term immigration in the contemporary United States. So we are honored and thrilled to have Dr. Cohen with us. And I should say, we were trying to do this last year, and then the pandemic kind of slowed us down, shut us down. So it's extra special that we're actually able to really, do this for this year's symposium. So welcome, Dr. Cohen, and I want to, thank you for being here with us tonight, and just give a moment for my colleague, Dr. Anna Stemport, to say hello as well.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Tony. Welcome, Elizabeth, to the 2nd annual Atlanta Global Studies Symposium. We're just so thrilled that presentations and talks like yours, along with the remarkable program spanning so many aspects of global significance and the importance of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals that are featured in this year's program. Honored and thrilled that we're able to launch this, have a virtual conference, and I want to thank Tony, of course, and also Diana Wren-Rapp and Shebnem Oskan, along with a number of graduate students who are running the show behind the scenes and DJing and so forth. So really, these are the kinds of things that the Atlanta Global Studies Center values. We're a U.S. Department of Education Title VI National Resource Center. Our motto is to convene, champion, collaborate, and to advance the Atlanta region's global agenda as a higher education hub. Can't wait to hear the talk. Keep your questions coming through the chat, and welcome again to this year's symposium.
Thank you, Anna. And before I turn it over to Dr. Cohen, just a quick housekeeping. Note that the session is being recorded. Please do keep microphones muted. And if you have questions or points that you'd want to bring up, please do put those in the chat. We'll have ample time for discussion. And so we want to make sure we're able to capture that. There's also, I should note, for those who would prefer, there's a live transcript. Closed captioning is available. So it's one of the little boxes at the bottom of your Zoom app. And so without any further ado, let me introduce Dr. Elizabeth Cohen.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tony and Anna and Diana, for this incredibly kind invitation and for creating this space where we can talk about immigration. And I'm so honored that you have all chosen to attend. I do feel like I want to acknowledge that this is a pretty momentous evening, and people may have a lot on their minds as we're getting news about this incredibly important verdict in the Derek Chauvin case. And I know it's on a lot of people's minds right now, and that you may be feeling some feelings. And so I appreciate that you're here. I'm going to be talking also about matters of justice, and the matters of justice that I'm here to focus on have to do with immigration and immigration enforcement. And I'm going to try and tell a story. I'm going to try and keep it fairly brief so that we can really dig in a discussion and interact and engage. But I want to start by saying that even though this is a story about immigration enforcement, which we have been talking about in really bold terms for 4 years now, this is not a story about Donald Trump's presidency or his legacy. It is really a story about Bill Clinton and George Bush and Barack Obama and Donald Trump and now Joe Biden. So really, in essence, this is our story. And if we don't like it, we're the ones who are going to have to try and rewrite the ending. This is a story in some senses about greed and about some people who don't care how they make their money. And it is a story about white nationalists, fear mongering, and federal agencies run amok. So there's a lot going on here, but I think it's really important to say that Donald Trump did not get us to the point that we are at. And really very little, if anything, has changed for immigrants or for people doing immigration enforcement during these first months of Biden's comforter-in-chief presidency. So now that I've set the scene, I'd like to start with some facts that kind of describe where things stand today in the United States, and then briefly take us back in history, and then try and very, very generally gesture at a way forward. So some facts. The undocumented immigrant population in the United States stopped growing probably in around 2007, possibly a little bit earlier, and it's declined about 13% since then. The number of people who are arrested for entering the country without a valid visa or without an inspection by USCIS, as opposed to overstaying a visa, is about as low as it's ever been since 1972. All of that really started before Trump did any border buildup, really before he was on the radar as a presidential candidate. And data from both Pew and Center for Migration Studies, and also even Department of Homeland Security itself, all show this downward trend in undocumented immigration. Probably it started around 2000, but it really picks up momentum in 2008 during the Great Recession. And the levels have been dropping or plateaued ever since then. And at the same time that people stopped crossing without papers, largely, we also saw increasing numbers of undocumented immigrants leaving the country each year, just as incoming people fell off. So even if we account for the recent spikes of asylum seekers trying to enter the United States and seasonal and periodic surges of people trying to enter to seek asylum, is perfectly normal pattern, we just aren't seeing the kind of migration that we saw in the 1990s. Things have really changed. Despite this decline, we've been a pretty massive enforcement arms race that started in the early 2000s, actually right around when the decline in incoming immigration started. So right now, the budget for interior enforcement, and interior enforcement is only one of the 3 divisions of Department of Homeland Security that are devoted to the enforcement of immigration policy. It's about 10 times larger than the budget for the entire INS, all 3 agencies put together that did Border Patrol, Interior Enforcement, and Naturalization Services back in 1993. It's just enormous. They siphon money from the Coast Guard, from the Army, from other security agencies. They will just take any resources they can see, get their sights on. So I want to talk a little bit about this enforcement system. And as many of you probably know, there are 3 main agencies that address immigration issues in the United States. So Customs and Border Protection, CBP, which polices the border, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, which is known as ICE, and then USCIS, which is United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. Customs and Border Protection works in a 100-mile deep zone around the entire perimeter of the United States. And 2/3 of the US population is in the zone. So although it sounds like they're kind of at the border in a very small area, they're actually really policing, for all intents and purposes, most of the country. ICE polices the interior. They're also allowed at the border, but they do a lot of interior enforcement. They also are responsible for detention, and they do their own sets of deportations. And then USCIS is responsible for doing things like issuing visas and naturalizing people and dealing with the ever shrinking welcome mat that we extend to so few people. The agencies themselves are new. None of them existed before 2002. That's when the Department of Homeland Security was created. And prior to that, we just had one agency that did welcome mat and enforcement, and had done so since 1932. That was a really big reorganization of the federal government we undertook after the September 11th attacks. Customs and Border Protection is the country's largest federal law enforcement agency. It's larger than the FBI, the DEA, all the other federal law enforcement agencies. It has around 60,000 employees. ICE, although ICE contracts out a lot of work, ICE is only about 20,000. It's way more agents than something like the FBI. It's not a well-run agency. It's kind of famously poorly run. In 2014, the head of internal affairs at CBP actually blew the whistle on the agency, saying that the hiring surges that they had engaged in since 9/11 within Border Patrol had led to the recruitment of thousands of officers, and this is their quote, potentially unfit to carry a badge and a gun. And keep in mind, they have military grade weapons, CBP does. In fact, this has actually always been the case. It's always been really hard to get qualified people to do Border Patrol work. They hire serial killers, substance abusers. They're widely known to be found trafficking, actually, the very thing that they're supposed to be stopping at the border. CBP agents are often engaged in. CBP agents are about 5 times more likely than any other law enforcement agents to be arrested. And they've been caught torturing people, collaborating illegally with armed citizen militias that dress up like they're border police. And the CBP tends to kind of lie or just ignore internal investigations, even court orders sometimes. Really, really unruly agency. ICE is big and bad in some different ways. Some are the same, but some different. I just want to give you a sense of how the growth of the detention industry has taken place. In 1994, which was actually a point when a lot of people were entering the country unauthorized, we had about 6,800 persons in detention on any given day during that year. And we tend to measure these things per day because people don't necessarily all stay in detention that long. And now, and I'm going to give you pre-pandemic numbers because we have had a momentary drop due to the pandemic. We had about 47,000 immigrants incarcerated on any given day. So 6,800 to 47,000 during a period when the undocumented population in the US has actually declined. 14 to 18,000 children in federal custody, immigration custody, some under the age of 5. And some of these children are incarcerated for years at a time. So it's a really dramatic situation. Between 2010 and 2016, ICE officials indicated to journalists who were investigating that they received about 33,000 complaints of physical and sexual abuse in their facilities. Just in the last 2 years, about 22 adults that we know of, died in ICE custody. And ICE actually just briefly stopped updating their website. So they made it really difficult for us to know what's going on. We spend about $18 billion a year on immigration enforcement in the United States. A good portion of the money that goes to ICE to do that ends up in the hands of executives who run the private detention and monitoring facilities that ICE tends to rely on. You may have heard that President Biden committed to ending private detention facilities for federal inmates. That is not the case for ICE, which is by far the biggest client for private prison companies. They've said nothing about the contracts also for what we call e-carceration, electronic incarceration, which can turn any of your neighborhoods essentially into a prison. GeoGroup and CoreCivic are famous for doing this work. And those technologies, although they tend to sound humane, they're highly problematic. They have really big data privacy problems, malfunctions that can lead to grave danger for the people who have the monitoring equipment, but actually for all of us. In 2017, things got so bad within ICE that the sub-agency that is directly responsible for actual immigration security, it's known as Homeland Security Investigations, they actually wrote to Kirstjen Nielsen, who's then secretary, and asked her to separate them out from ICE, to remove them from ICE, because they felt that being a part of ICE actually just damaged their reputation and the integrity of their work. So you hear a lot about ICE and CBP abusing immigrants, or you hear a lot about immigrant rights. You're less likely to hear about the fact that non-immigrants, US citizens, are often caught up in both ICE and CBP's clutches. So about a year and a half ago, the ACLU issued a report, and they showed in all likelihood dozens of US citizens in just one Miami detention facility had been detained by ICE with the intention to deport. Cato Institute did a study. They did their own investigation of Travis County in Texas, which has become famous for other things during the election. But between 2005 and 2017, ICE targeted around 230 US citizens for detention deportation. And Cato extrapolated, so they did kind of a statistical estimate that they think during that period of time, probably in that county alone, 3,500 US citizens were, or in the state, sorry, US citizens were targeted for deportation. It probably amounts to many thousands across the country. ACLU suspects that what they uncovered in one Florida facility means there's hundreds of cases in Florida alone. There's a research clinic at Northwestern University that used FOIA requests to uncover hundreds of cases in which US citizens have been detained by ICE, some pending deportation, and in some cases, US citizens actually get deported because they don't have access either to good counsel or to the documents that they need. It's very, very hard to re-enter the United States once you've been deported. It can be very difficult to recover from. These types of incidents aren't necessarily going to stop under the Biden administration unless we make massive changes to how we think about borders and enforcement, including a lot of the things that are actually legal for US immigration enforcement agents to do. Customs and Border Protection in particular is actually exempt from certain parts of the Fourth Amendment that other law enforcement agents are guided by or are governed by. And I could say pretty safely, we've seen no indication that President Biden wants to back off from aggressive enforcement or rein these agencies in, like his Democratic predecessors. And I'm thinking of Obama, who he served with, but also Bill Clinton, who was extremely aggressive about immigration enforcement and is responsible for a lot of this infrastructure. Also, like most congressional Democrats, border security is something that Biden seems to embrace. So Biden has presented a program for possibly regularizing undocumented immigrants, but it's really predicated on more and not less aggressive policing by the agencies we have. And because President Biden also, one of his main goals in immigration policy is to have more temporary workers coming into the United States, it's probably a certainty that there will also be an undocumented population associated with the changes that he makes, because overstaying a visa, now that we're seeing much less unauthorized border crossing, is one of the main reasons we have an undocumented population in the United States. So the enforcement machine is really going to continue. I'd like to step back just for a moment and put this in a little bit of context and just let you know that there wasn't a such thing as illegal immigration or undocumented immigration as a crime that was penalized until 1929. So it just didn't exist as a legal federal category. That's the year we created the penalties. And we had pretty closed immigration at the time. We reopened our borders in 1965, and it's really important to note that the congressman who reopened the borders did so explicitly thinking that what they could do was kind of keep the country's immigration highly European in origin and very stable. So they never really intended the kind of immigrant population that we now know is an important part of the United States. In other words, they were part of a tradition that had been a very racialized immigration tradition from the outset. The story of the 20th century is really one in which we transformed from a country where the legal boundary between citizens and non-citizens was permeable into a country with a lot of foreign-born people whose legal status will prevent them from ever becoming citizens. So I think that this is like one of the reasons that it's kind of a foregone conclusion that the story of the 21st century, where we find ourselves now, is a story of really expensive, really aggressive enforcement and the types of agencies that demand a lot of autonomy to do that. So like we can talk about the fact that the Trump administration closed off opportunities for asylum, probably illegally, that the refugee cap for 2021 was set to 18,000. But it should not come as a surprise that Biden has proactively refused to change either of these circumstances. So asylum seekers are still being turned away by the Title 42 policy, which is, again, probably unconstitutional and may actually be demonstrated to be unconstitutional. But he has refused to change that. We talk about the fact that children are still effectively being separated from, in some cases, their parents, in other cases, families that are seeking asylum at the southern border from the Northern Triangle countries. We learned last week that the 2021 cap for refugee admissions would not be raised from the Trump levels. So we'd been told that it was going to be raised probably to over 100,000, which would be perfectly in line with where we were during every year since around 1980 until the Trump administration entered. But like, this is very clearly not a story that we can focus on Donald Trump. It's a story that I think really needs to focus on the fact that we give so much power to ICE and to Customs and Border Protection, and to kind of look at what it would take to undo this, or to put ourselves in a position where these agencies wouldn't have so much power. So there's a number of different proposals that the Biden administration has put on the table, and some of them involve regularization. Largely, I think we have a sense that what Biden wants to do in terms of enacting changes to law is a starting point for negotiation, but not one that we're likely to see wholesale adopted in anything that Congress actually can agree to. Right now, I think we have no signs that Congress is ready to enact large-scale immigration reform. I mostly want to leave time for discussion, but I wanted to move my remarks toward their conclusion by talking about what I think that we should do. So we have a set of extraordinarily, unusually corrupt and pretty vicious and cruel and expensive enforcement agencies. Even if we wanted to keep doing as much enforcement as we've been doing, it would probably behoove us to rein these agencies in, because they are doing things that are damaging to our reputation. They're damaging to US citizens as well as non-citizens. They're really inefficient with resources, and they tend to encroach on our civil liberties. So the thing is, it's really hard to simply do away with agencies. The agencies are new, they don't have a long history, but they're really well entrenched. So I think that the most important thing we can do to kind of rein in the cruel and highly militarized culture of immigration enforcement in the United States is to suck the wind out of their sails, or another way that I put this is stop feeding the beast. And you stop feeding the beast when you create a means through which people who are in the United States but have no legal status have opportunities to make their status authorized, so to adjust their status. And there's lots of ways to do this. In 1986, we did have an amnesty. It's the only time we've had a large-scale amnesty in the United States. Amnesty is an unappealing word to a lot of people. I don't particularly care what we call it, but I want to go back to that moment in my concluding remarks, that moment I described in 1929, which was the bill called the Registry Act, in which we made it illegal and penalized people for being in the country without papers. And at that time, and I went back and looked at these floor debates when I wrote this book, congressmen were really appalled because they were getting letters from constituents who were saying, I've been in this country for 10 years. I'm a doctor. I'm married to a US citizen. I have children here, and I'm terrified I'm going to be deported because of these new penalties. what should I do? And the congressmen were like, this is mortifying, embarrassing, and un-American. How could we do this to people who are living in this country as if they are US citizens? That's un-American, it's undemocratic. They were really punitive and also really principled in their own way. So they created a provision that's called registry, and it said that anyone who had been in the country since 1921, whether or not they were in the country authorized, whether or not they'd come the right way, which we all know is a relatively new invention, they would be eligible for an adjustment of status. They could become US citizens over time. And so registry was like this kind of amnesty provision, but built in, it didn't expire. And we've updated the registry date. So it starts at 1921. We've updated it 4 times. But the last time we updated the registry date was 1986. We updated it to 1973. And so this makes it something that's already on the books. It's there. All we have to do would be set a new date or possibly a schedule for updates. And anybody who's been living in the country for a period of years in every other way as a lawful resident, except for their paperwork, would become eligible eventually to become citizens. I think there's some advantages to this, and this is just the last thing I'm going to say. Registry is a really gradual thing. It's not like an amnesty in the sense that a whole bunch of people become eligible and then it's over. It's an ongoing process by which we acknowledge that people become Americans after a period of time living in the country. And that's a longstanding principle we've been committed to. It's embedded in our naturalization laws as well. I really think that this kind of gradualism is one of the only ways we're going to kind of suck the wind out of the sails of Customs and Border Protection and ICE and remove from them the subjects of their actions, their cruelty, and their use of resources. So I don't think, this kind of one-time amnesty that Biden is proposing is necessarily the right way. I think the best thing about registry is that it's an ongoing way to recognize the citizenization of long-term non-citizen residents. So that's one of the 3 policy proposals I make in the book. I'm happy to talk about the others in the discussion, but I think that's really the most important one. I want to say this one last thing, which is, when people listen to me talk about immigration, there's one question that often comes up, and I want to answer it before I get asked, and then I'm happy to elaborate on it in the discussion. But people ask me, am I one of those crazy open borders people? And here's what I have to say about that. So I've given some illustrations of kind of how out of control our immigration enforcement system is. I think anything that requires that much money and gets that little done should have to justify itself. So I don't really necessarily want to litigate open or closed borders. We can talk about free movement, but border enforcement itself has never been something we've ever done successfully. So in my book, if you want to lock up families and toddlers and millions of adults, you're going to have to show me that it accomplishes something. And that is a very hard thing to do. I'm not sure that's possible. If you want to turn our borders into war zones, very expensive war zones where parts of the 4th Amendment are not enforced, you have to show me that there's a reason that I should give up my safety and my rights. And I think that's very hard to do. And if you want immigration policy that funnels money to private corporations and away from national security, you're going to have to show me that that accomplishes something. And right now, I don't think that's something that can be done. We're not really, our immigration enforcement regime isn't in a shambles because immigration is some kind of problem. In fact, probably low rates of immigration are a bigger problem. It's a shambles because we've let people who have their own interests, primarily financial interests at stake, steer the ship. And that's where we really need to make a departure and move ourselves away. So I'm going to stop talking now because I think discussion and Q&A is probably what we need to do right now and kind of turn things back over to our moderator to get that going. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it was such a great presentation. And one of the things that your comments and as I was reading illegal reminded me of, so several years back we hosted Douglas Massey, and he talked about you kind of started to get to this at the very end about sort of the notion of are you for open or closed borders? And one of the things I remember about his work and his presentation with us, I wanted to ask you to kind of comment on or riff on a little bit, perhaps, is he talked about it actually as backfiring. He said, there were actually circular patterns, especially on the southern US border with Mexico, that had a lot more to do with seasonal labor and people going in and going out. And it was much more sort of fluid, but not in a problematic sense. And when it became problematic is when there was sort of a closing, and as much as it would trap people in, as much as trap people out. And I wondered what you thought about that, that take on how some of the things led to where we got.
Yeah. So first of all, what excellent decision to bring Doug Massey in. His work is invaluable. And his discussion of the disruption of circular patterns of migration is one of my favorite parts of his work, because he shows how, and I think it's his phrase, but it might be Brian Turner's phrase, that we've created, like they call it an enclave society, in which we accidentally walled ourselves in a way that makes everybody's free movement much more difficult, in some cases impossible. So, there's kind of a very common, pretty outdated notion that what people do is settle and stay in one place. And in fact, not only is that not what happens, but in the United States in particular, it was never really what was happening. So not only was there a lot of back and forth in which people came for a while and then left, and that was regarded as problematic, right? So that the founders all the way through probably the 1940s thought what people should do is settle, and that you're kind of not a good potential American if you don't want to stay here. But nobody was ever really doing that. There was all this circularity, and that increases as mobility becomes cheaper. And Doug's work really shows that we interrupted circular migration patterns and people who want to live fully transnational lives, and forced them into staying in the United States because they couldn't either surreptitiously or just openly move back and forth. And I'll just say, one more thing about this. So first of all, we've all discovered what immobility regimes are like during the pandemic, when those of us who used to travel constantly and go to places like Atlanta in March and April can't do that anymore. But also international travel has become really problematic. But the border itself is a place that, if you haven't thought about it or visited the border, doesn't exist the way it does on a map. Borders are really fluid spaces, and the creation of a border patrol was very much not welcomed by either people in the US or on the Mexican side of the border, because they had a really robust tourism, trade, and transnational families who needed to go back and forth all the time. And we're like, who are these people from Washington telling us we can't do this? This is really bad for the economy, and it's bad for our lives. And also it was bad because they were breaking the prohibition laws, but we won't talk about that.
One other question I thought about in looking through the work that you said that, how we treat our non-citizens is a canary in a coal mine for democracy. And I wanted to ask, what you meant by that, and kind of how we're, kind of seeing that manifest in terms of the immigration discussion.
Yeah, so I think a crystallizing moment, and I should have made people who weren't aware of this before feel really afraid, was last summer during protests, when people realized the Department of Homeland Security was actually detaining and arresting US citizens, which is something we know that they've done. Like, I just demonstrated that they've done this, but I think was not widely advertised, and is not necessarily something that they're empowered to do. But what we saw were, first of all, Customs and Border Protection drones flying over Minneapolis during the protests following the murder of George Floyd. But also we saw in Portland, CBP. And if you were a journalist or a a lawyer dealing with immigration stuff, you knew this was going to happen because journalists and lawyers have been harassed, in some cases arrested, had their privacy compromised, been spied on by ICE for a very long time. So when I say canary in the coal mine, I mean, it's really easy to think of yourself as a US citizen as not at all subject to whatever goes on that affects the border or non-citizens, and to not be particularly worried about all the weapons and all the privacy compromising technologies and all the permission that Customs and Border Protection has to enter your property, to have to, without a warrant, stop you and question you and detain you. But in fact, these are things that aren't just happening to immigrants in the United States. They're things that can and do happen to US citizens. And the fact that they're happening more to immigrants, that's just the beginning. Eventually, that big a police force with that little discipline is going to pose a problem for citizens as well. So that's kind of why I use that phrase.
Yeah, it's a critically important point. And I have one more question that I wanted to ask you about before we're starting to see some things come in the chat, which is great. One, sort of issue, and I saw this, it reminded me earlier this, I guess yesterday or the day before, I was watching Fox News, because usually that's good for some kind of fodder for some question. And of course, there was a lot of the sort of conflation of terrorism and immigration, and especially around the southern border. And we talked a little bit about this before, and I mentioned, one of my graduate fellows who is here today is doing this work for her dissertation. But what do you make of that? The sort of conflation of this sort of immigration and refugees, status and seeking asylum with, the threat of terrorism, because it does get sort of ginned up. It does make its way into sort of a populist and nationalist space. But is there any empirical or support or any data there at all to speak of?
No, I mean, that's like the worst answer. I can like discuss this, but I was astonished. So the reason we're having this discussion is because the Department of Homeland Security was created as a response to the terrorist attacks of September 11th. And, it was like a hasty patch-up job. It was not a well-designed agency. It was like the biggest reorganization of the federal government since the creation of the Department of Defense. So really a big deal. But, Bush himself did not support the elevation of DHS to cabinet level. He was very skeptical and only went along with it once it was clear this was going to get through. But there were lots and lots of mistakes made. But once the pretext for the creation of all of these agencies was the threat of terrorism, there was always going to be a need to justify on the basis of national security, the big budgets, the weapons, and the power. And so even though I know this, when I went to do the research for this book, I was shocked that they can't produce anyone to show that, like, there's literally nobody coming across the southern border that they can show came with the intention of committing terrorist acts. And like, I'd be super interested to hear what your doctoral student has found, but it's easy to associate borders with national security. It's actually hard to make people realize that borders are violent and dangerous, and kind of the more gently we treat our border, the safer we are. But because these agencies were framed as supporting national security, I think it's very hard to root out that perception, even though it's not based in any reality.
Yeah, that leads me. I just posted a link because in advance of your talk, I was kind of looking at some of these programs we heard about sort of originating and gaining steam in the last few years. So we're now four months and a day into the Biden administration. And I just, I wanted to point out that there is this ICE voice program. So the Victims of Immigration Crime Engagement is a program. And it says it was established to fulfill President Trump's commitment to help people affected by criminal activity perpetrated by criminal aliens. Now, 4 months and a day into the Biden administration, and this thing is still up and still alive and still well. So I think your point about the sort of continuity is really well taken, and I just wanted to offer that as like evidence of it.
And you know, the thing is, it's very hard to convey this, but the crime rates among people who are not US citizens, whether you break it down documented or undocumented, they're lower than for native-born US citizens. Like, there's not an immigrant crime problem, particularly if you take out all the artificial crimes that are created but with immigration violations.
Yeah. And more likely to be victimized, in fact, because you if you report it, you then risk your, other things about being deported. And so I do want to move to some of the questions coming in. So my colleague Demeji, who is joining us from Spelman College and is a colleague and part of our Atlanta Global Studies Center, asks if you can address the media representation of the position of political aspirants, and to what extent might that like fuel entry or fuel attempts, like we're seeing the sort of movement of people. I thought, the borders were going to open up when Biden became president. It brings back that conversation about the caravans. And Demeji, please jump in if I'm getting any of this wrong. But that surge is something he pointed out is in particular.
Yeah. So ever since at least 1986, there's been an argument made that either, the possibility for less policing. We've never actually done less policing of the border. Once we started, we've only increased the border policing. But the perception that we might reduce the policing at the border, or that we might offer people citizenship who don't have visas to be lawfully present in the United States, would encourage people to essentially increase the numbers of unlawful immigrants. And one of the really hard things to do when we talk about immigration is to make arguments that are counter to our intuition. So the intuition, because like we all have some sense of rational choice, is that like, well, that's rational when people get information that they're going to be able to do something they want to do without consequence or with good consequences, they will do it. It unfortunately does not always work that way. So first of all, right now, most of our migration flows at the southern border are Central Americans. Information is just not flowing. Like, the amount of inaccurate information is vast. So I would be very surprised if people got an accurate message about what's going on either at the border or on the interior. But more importantly, if you look at really like what has generated the disruption that leads to people leaving Northern Triangle countries and trying to come to the United States, it's all stuff that has happened generated by the US. And two things in particular. First of all, we have a long, like all the way back to the early 20th century history of interfering in the politics and the economies of those three countries. So we did a lot of disruptive stuff for around 100 years. But also in the 1980s, we start deporting members of US gangs, particularly from Los Angeles, to the Northern Triangle countries. So these were people who'd been incarcerated in Los Angeles, and they had been a part of El Barrio and then MS-13, and we deported them. And of course, that also essentially exported a gang problem that was US born, but really took root in those countries. And the violence generated by those gangs has caused a lot of people to feel forced out of those countries and to try and claim asylum. So like, when I look at what's really happened, like what could we have done differently to not be in this position? It's not a simple like, oh, the 1986 amnesty told people to come here, or they think we're not policing the border. It's these other choices that we made that I think had the most impact.
Mm-hmm. That's one of the sort of follow-on questions here that I think may, sort of be, can follow from that is then, when people do get here, more sort of getting into some of the policy and pragmatic. So we have one question that says, want to hear more about your policy ideas and prescriptions. Another that says, what do you do with the children at the border who kind of are now in? So whatever the promise or the information, now we've got, sort of real people in this sort of space. So what would you say about, that sort of in a more pragmatic sense, I suppose?
Yeah. So political theorists can be pragmatic, and I really want to be pragmatic about immigration, but pragmatic in a way that adheres to basic human rights principles. And I'm going to take the children question first and say it's very hard for people to believe this, but we don't actually have to detain children and put them in what are really, really, truly abhorrent living conditions. So like Customs and Border Protection, has something called the ice box, where they have left mothers and children freezing, sometimes for days, very, very inadequate food. We've talked about tents and things like that. In fact, two things. First of all, we don't have to assume that people are traveling in unsafe conditions when they can demonstrate that they're family members. So we have rules about children needing to be with parents, but in many cases, children are coming in with aunts or uncles, other family members, and there's just no justification for separating them or for incarcerating them when they are family to each other. But also, there are nonprofit organizations that can place children in home situations when they are unaccompanied, so that we never have to put them essentially in little child jails where they stay sometimes for far too long. There are nonprofits that are very good at caring for children and placing them in homes. So this idea that like, well, what are we going to do? We're forced to incarcerate children and to separate them from their family members it's not true. We don't have to do that. For larger, sorry, did you want to?
Yeah, no, go ahead. Yeah, please.
In terms of larger scale policy proposals, I'll just quickly run through the other two, which are in some ways, policies not as exciting as it could be. But the first thing is we did fine in this country without Department of Homeland Security for a long time, and it's just a bad agency. And I really think that we need to acknowledge this. It's only been around since 2002, or it was passed in 2002. We were much better off before these three agencies existed, when we had one agency. In general, I think border policing is fruitless, expensive, and violent. But we did have the INS as one agency that was very devoted also to the ways in which we need to welcome immigrants into the United States. I really think there's almost no good being done by Department of Homeland Security as an organizational structure. So I advocate for removing it. And then the other thing, which is truly, truly the unsexiest of things to discuss in terms of policy, but has a good rhyme. So I'm going to give you the rhyme, which is we need to fix 96. 1996, with the support of Bill Clinton, Congress passed two really monumental pieces of legislation that utterly transformed the bases on which we could incarcerate anybody who's a non-citizen. And I'm saying it that way because we are not just talking about illegal, undocumented immigrants. They lowered the bar so far that for incarceration, that people with very small misdemeanors can be incarcerated if they're not US citizens and then deported. So once millions and millions of people suddenly became eligible for incarceration and deportation, there was money to be earned from private prison companies. And there was a very successful sudden criminalization of just immigrant as a status. So in people's heads, it really became fixed that like, oh, look at all these millions of people who are locked up and they're immigrants, and immigrants, criminals. And we have to go back to a time before we were locking immigrants up for tiny, tiny misdemeanors. giving them no due process in many cases, and in some cases deporting people before they've even had their immigration hearings. Everything went really, really wrong starting in 1996. So Fix 96 is one of my other really big policy proposals.
And I think that's really like, it goes to the point where, and I think you raise this in the book, just that you say, people say, look at sort of some of the immigration, sort of the violations, like things that are observable now in the news coverage, and people say, that's not who we are. And I think, after, reading your book and seeing sort of the way you marshal the evidence and the support, you say, well, not only is that who we are, but it's who we've been for a really long time. And so things that kind of take us back, over 20 years and a lot longer, sort of make that case. There was one point that came out here that I thought was interesting. And, you raised the question about the open borders. And one of the questions is, well, why not talk about open borders in the sense that it also is disadvantageous to US citizens in terms of its level of sort of restriction? Do you think that kind of argument might get any traction?
Yeah, so I think there's two angles to kind of come at that. One is pragmatic, and to say there's a lot of benefits to open migration, which is true. If there's any problem in terms of material consequences in the United States, it's that we are like on a demographic cliff in terms of birth rates and in terms of an aging population. And we already know what happens in countries that allow themselves to get to that brink. It's terrible for economies. We have great new studies coming out showing pretty persuasively, or I should say authoritatively, that when we don't have immigration, although, and this is another to kind of come back to the intuitiveness, people think like, oh, there'll be more jobs, and the wages for those jobs will rise if we simply don't have immigrant workers in the country. And actually the opposite is true. Jobs tend to disappear when we don't have immigrants. Companies that can automate, and companies that can't often vanish. So employment prospects are dramatically reduced when immigration is cut off, and wages don't really rise for US citizens either. So there's this material argument. And I don't want to make that argument, even though I firmly believe it's true, because I don't actually think that human beings have to like prove that they're useful to deserve to exist. So I'll just say this. Free movement is well established as an important human right. It's one of the most important human rights. It's often the choice of last resort for people who can't survive where they are. And I say this as somebody who's only here because my family exercised their rights to free movement when countries weren't granting those rights very readily or at all. They came as refugees. I've never heard an argument against free movement that was made by somebody who wasn't enjoying the right to free movement. So I want to see people who say we shouldn't have free movement give up their rights to free movement. And I don't think that will happen, because I think we know deep down that that is a human right that people should be allowed to exercise.
Yeah, and I know we have time for one more point, but you just brought up something that I really, I did want to ask you this. And in the intro to the book, you talk about your family's experience, and it's sort of how it kind of cast your interest in not only sort of in an academic kind of intellectual curiosity space, but really like the lived experience in people's, your family's ability to move and flee in the Holocaust. And I just wanted to ask, I know we always get interested in like kind of the data and the other kind of things that are part of the research, but there's this whole other thing that I thought was really important, and I would be remiss if I didn't at least ask or bring it up, and I'm glad you did. It's just like how that sort of has informed and shaped who you are as a scholar and your kind of work in this area.
Yeah. So I'm the daughter of a refugee. My mother and her parents and her sister were in a refugee camp, probably we estimate for about 5 years, because there were no visas to go almost anywhere. And they were stateless. So it's very, very hard to travel if you're stateless. They just, no one would take them. And so personally, you know, my whole life, I've just not been able to wrap my head around what good fortune can befall one person, and that's me, and that there were other people in the world that only through the accident of where they were born don't have that good fortune. And I think so, you know, I guess somehow you have to pay back your good fortune. I'm trying to. But I think it's really important to focus our heads on the fact that we're having this conversation, and there are millions of people either in camps right now who have been waiting for years for some country to let them live, or who aren't even under the protection of a camp, and are totally insecure because they're trapped in an unsafe war zone or where they're being persecuted. Like they are there and we're here and we're safe. And we have a really, really profound human obligation, I think, to not let that slip from our heads, and to be pushing on our administration, our government, our democracy, to live up to its principles and take some responsibility for the human suffering that its negligence is allowing to persist.
Well, I thank you so much. I know we're just about at time, so I wanted to, you know, that I can't think of a more sort of powerful way to sort of, you know, conclude. And on that point, and just for us to think about, you know, as scholars, as citizens, as students, you know, how we can engage this space. For those of us, you know, in the Atlanta region, I mean, we, you know, have a lot of opportunities right here in our own backyard, especially even at Georgia State University, one of our campuses in Clarkston, which is really where a lot of refugee resettlement has happened historically, and, you know, it persists, and there's ways to be active, ways to be involved. So I would encourage all of us to look at that. I do, you know, want to thank you so much, Elizabeth, for this great presentation and conversation, and really enriching. I'd like to, you know, thank our co-sponsors for the symposium, the School of Modern Languages at Georgia Tech and our Office of International Initiatives, all of the people who've been sort of instrumental in putting this together. We'll be able to share the recording for those who weren't able to be here in person. But again, you know, for those who can, you know, attend some more of the symposium throughout the week, please do. And what a great presentation and conversation. I think on behalf of all of us, you know, we owe you a debt of gratitude.
Well, thank you all for engaging in this conversation. Just knowing that we're all in this together is really strengthening. So I appreciate the opportunity very much.
Outstanding. And with that, we are right at 6:30. So we promised an hour, and we're good there. So again, thank you so much. And thanks everybody for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.